Hello and welcome back to World War II Part 24. This is the Pacific Theatre 1942 Part 3. At which point, after the Pacific Theatre in 1942 is finished, we will jump to the Eastern Front before then jumping to North Africa and Europe. So basically, okay, on 9th of March, 1942, the last Dutch unit still fighting in Java surrendered to Japanese. Now, this means that the Japanese have basically taken control of the entire Dutch East Indies, okay, in a rapid campaign. Now, in New Guinea, okay, meanwhile, American aircraft hit a Japanese troop convoy in the Gulf of Huon. The Japanese Air Force continues its raids on Australian and British positions on the island. The Japanese have secured Dutch East Indies, but fighting is still going on in many areas. The Japanese are all over. Now, in New Guinea, another Japanese landing occurs on 104 American aircraft from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, of course, who will play major roles in upcoming battles this year. Bomb Lai and Salamaua, okay, damaging Japanese shipping and airfields. Now, Japanese aircraft from Rabaul in New Britain carry out neutralisation raids on Port Moresby. Meanwhile, in Solomon Islands, the Japanese land on Buka. Now, okay, March 1942, General Douglas MacArthur with his personal staff and Rear Admiral Rockwell, together with members of General Staff, leave Luzon in the Philippines on board 4 motor torpedo boats for Mindanao. Now, emotional but determined, the South Pacific Commander-in-Chief promises, "I shall return," and indeed he does. Now, in Burma, okay, meanwhile, under the constant Japanese offensive there, Allied troops take up defensive positions to keep the Japanese out of the northern part of Burma. Now, 17th Indian Division, okay, is deployed near Tharawadi in the Irrawaddy Valley, and the 1st Burmese Division takes up positions in the upper Sitang Valley. Now, Lieutenant General Stilwell, okay, US Army, is appointed to command the Chinese 5th and 6th Armies. The 5th Army is to concentrate at Mandalay, while the 6th Army garrisons the Shan states. Another Chinese division is deployed in the Toungoo area. So basically, okay, Winston Churchill also says, speaks on India during this time, saying Sir Stafford Cripps is to be sent to India to prepare the way for India's independence. And on the 12th of March, 1942, okay, 17,500 Americans commanded by General Patch land at Noumea, okay, to garrison the island and build and equip air installations. Now, following fall of Rangoon, okay, the British base in the Andaman Islands is no longer defensible, and the garrison is taken off by seaplanes. Meanwhile, in Burma, the Allied headquarters is set up near Mandalay. In New Guinea, having consolidated positions around Lai and Salamau, the Japanese replaced their infantry, okay, with naval personnel. And in the Solomon Islands, the capture of Buka and other islands in the north of the archipelago is completed. The landing operation is protected by Japanese 4th Fleet, okay, based on Rabaul, which is located in New Britain. Now, on the 14th of March, okay, General MacArthur and his staff arrive on Mindanao. So basically, in Philippines, in Bay Manila, okay, Japanese artillery is getting reinforced, okay, and launches incessant attacks, on in the Bay of Manila. This intensified fire continues for a week. In Burma, General Stilwell, okay, notified the Commander-in-Chief of Operations in Burma is still General Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of Allied Forces in India. But basically, disagreements between General Stilwell and General Wavell have broken out about who controls what theatre and where. Now, by order of President Roosevelt, also in March 1942, General MacArthur flies from Mindanao to Darwin in Australia, where he's to assume command of Allied forces in Southwest Pacific. Now, territorial limits of his command have still to be worked out. However, by this agreement with Allied governments, the USA takes over responsibility for strategic defence of the whole of the Pacific Ocean, basically. Now, in the New Hebrides Saturdays, okay, American infantry and engineers arrive on Efat to build an airfield. Now, meanwhile, in Burma, General William Slim, okay, arrives to assume command at British forces, now regrouped to form the 1st Burmese Corps. Now, in the Sitang Valley, the Japanese advance, on Tungu, which is defended by a Chinese division. Meanwhile, in Philippines, General Wainwright is appointed to command all American forces in the Philippine theatre. Now, General Wainwright follows his appointment, okay, by setting up his headquarters on the fortified island of Corregidor. His chief of staff is General Beebe, while General King takes command of American and Filipino forces located on the island of Luzon. In Burma, the 1st Burmese Division is deployed on the Irrawaddy front, leaving a vast sector of Tungu open. Now, defence of this town at line of the Tungu Prom is undertaken by Japanese 5th Army in collaboration with British. Now, Japanese attacks on the airfields reduce the already low strength of Allied aircraft defending the area. The Japanese are clearly moving to establish air superiority in the area, which will make their going far easier and bring much more pressure to bear on the Allied troops in Burma. Now, heavy Japanese air raids on Magway airfield force the British and American aircraft to move near the Chinese border to Akyab. Now, the British troops defending Burma, therefore, are pretty much deprived of all close air support, so the Japanese do indeed gain an air superiority. Meanwhile, the Chinese in the Tungu sector hold out against incessant Japanese attacks. And meanwhile, Japanese planes actually bomb Darwin in North Australia. Now, in the Andaman Islands, okay, Japanese occupy the islands, okay, in Bay of Bengal, evacuated by British and Gurkha garrisons. So no sooner have the seaplanes flown the Allied troops out, the Japanese land and secure the island. Now, on Philippines, okay, on Luzon, the Japanese begin a series of land and air bombardments in the Bataan Peninsula. They've been holding out there for months and still the fighting goes on. Now, aircraft based on island attack Corregidor incessantly and also begin air raids at night as well. So the air raids start coming pretty much over the full 24-hour period. In Burma, the Japanese make a surprise attack north of Tungu and put the Chinese and Burmese defenders to flight, almost completely surrounding the town. While in Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby is heavily bombed again. Now, in Burma, the 1st Burmese Corps, okay, the reformed Allied forces concentrates in the Prom Alan Mayo area. Now, this is to try and stabilise their line and also create a new fortified area. The Japanese capture part of the town of Tungu. A Chinese division is dispatched to reinforce the defenders of Tungu, still fighting in the town and on the outskirts. So rare in the Pacific, for the most part, a bit of city-type fighting. The Chinese 200th Division is still defending parts of Tungu on the Irrawaddy front from Japanese, while they concentrate forces south of Promi. While the increasing threat, okay, from the enemy RAF aircraft are withdrawn from the Akyab base and are now pulled back into India in full. So the Japanese ascendancy is clearly still ongoing. Now, in Philippines, okay, the Japanese prepare to launch the final offensive against the Bataan Peninsula. The supply situation at defenders has become precarious under incessant bombing and shelling. In Burma, okay, meanwhile, in response to a request by General Stilwell, General Alexander orders the 1st Burmese Corps to attack in the Irrawaddy sector, and the Japanese are vigorously engaged southwest of Promi. In Burma, to relieve Japanese pressure on Chinese in the Tungu sector, a special force from the 1st Burmese Corps attacks and occupies Pawangde. Now, its position soon becomes precarious when enemy takes up positions a little north of Padigon on the east bank of the Irrawaddy. Now, Chinese accuse the Japanese of using poison gas and bacteriological warfare, which is an interesting allegation. Now, in Burma, Chinese 200th Division abandons Tungu, unable to withstand Japanese pressure any longer. They've tried to put up a valiant fight and have held them for a time, but they have to pull back. Now, the special force from the 1st Burmese Corps falls back on Promi. In the evening, the Japanese attacked the 63rd Indian Brigade at Promi and quickly put them to flight, so that the 17th Indian Division's flank is left in a dangerous sector. In the Indian Ocean, meanwhile, Japanese land troops on Christmas Island, okay, south of Java, and in the Ascension Islands, a US detachment arrives on the small island between Africa and South America. Meanwhile, some changes, the Joint Chiefs of Staff divide the Pacific Theatre of Operations into two zones, the Pacific Ocean Zone under command of Admiral Nimitz and the Southwest Pacific Zone under command of General Douglas MacArthur. Now MacArthur, his zone now includes Australia, New Guinea, the Philippines, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Solomon Islands and much of the Dutch East Indies. Now conflicting attitudes to war soon emerges, reflected in different strategic principles. Nimitz believes in great leaps, while MacArthur supports a policy of reconquest from island to island, i.e. island hopping, that I also used to use in a game called Axis and Allies that I loved to play incessantly for years as a youngster. So at the end of March, in Burma, two Chinese divisions withdraw from the Toungoo sector. Now, but loss of Toungoo, the road to Mauchi lies open to Japanese, and small Japanese garrison there is overwhelmed a few days later. Now, meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, again, the Allies' Indian Squadron, located in the Indian Ocean, is commanded by British Admiral Sir James Somerville, consists of aircraft carriers Indomitable, Formidable and Hermes. They have 5 old battleships, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, are warned of an imminent Japanese attack. They sail from Ceylon and take refuge at a secret base in the Maldive Islands. Now, Japanese fleet in pursuit of them has sailed from Kendari in Celebes. It's under command of Admiral Kondo, who has under him Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, the Japanese fleet comprises the battleships Kongo, Haruma, Hei and Kirishima. The aircraft carriers Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku and Zuikaku, and 3 cruisers and 9 destroyers. It's decided to use these greatly superior forces to destroy the Allied fleet to eliminate a potentially serious threat to western flank of the ever now extended Japanese line in the Southwest Pacific. Now, in Burma, on the Irrawaddy front, the 1st Burmese Corps ordered to withdraw immediately from Promi, north of Promi, to avoid encirclement by the Japanese, while in New Guinea, Japanese units from Dutch East Indies land at many places on coast at Dutch New Guinea, from Sorong at the northwest tip of the island to Hollandia. Landings continue until April 20th and are virtually unopposed. So the Japanese continue landings for like nearly 3 weeks. In Burma, the Japanese, meanwhile, bomb Mandalay, killing over 2,000 people, and Mandalay is set aflame. The 1st Burmese Corps retires from Alanmeo, not under enemy pressure but on orders from GHQ. Now, in the Sitang Valley, General Stilwell's Chinese divisions take up defensive positions. In the Philippines, the Japanese, finally launched a big offensive in Bataan Peninsula against troops that are already exhausted, ill-equipped and running out of supplies. Their supplies have pretty much been cut. They have been fighting there for months. The Americans and the brave Filipino forces putting up an absolutely stout resistance for months against constant Japanese attacks. And as the Japanese have had successes, they've been fiercely counterattacked by the Filipino and American troops and pushed back in many areas. Landings have been set that have later been retaken. It has really been a valiant defence, but they are nearing the end with supplies dwindling. They will not be able to fight indefinitely. So the Japanese attack on the Bataan Peninsula is renewed, preceded by machine gun fire from air and an intensive artillery barrage to break down defenders' morale. At nightfall, the Japanese regroup for a new attack with Mount Samat as their chief objective. So, in the Indian Ocean, a British reconnaissance aircraft sights Admiral Kondo's squadron off Colombo and manages to give the alarm before being shot down by Mitsubishi Zero fighters, one of the finest fighters of the war. Now, in the Philippines, in Bataan Peninsula, after the usual air and artillery preparation, Japanese attack and take Mount Samat. The defending 21st Division is massacred in savage fighting. Now, a landing force of about 5,000 Japanese troops sails from Gulf of Lingayen, in Luzon, for Cebu, an island in central Philippines north of Mindanao. Now, meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean, okay, the Japanese fleet that has been chasing and trying to hunt down the British fleet, at dawn, okay, on April 5th, 200 Japanese aircraft bombers, dive bombers and fighters take off from the aircraft carriers 200 miles south of Ceylon. Now, they sight and destroy 12 British torpedo planes sent to attack the Japanese ships. The Japanese planes attack Colombo, believing Admiral Somerville's squadron is still at anchor there, but no ships are in the harbour, but the Japanese are able to destroy the port installations, and while the aircraft are regrouping, a reconnaissance aircraft sent up from the cruiser Tone reports the presence of 2 British cruisers southwest of Ceylon. 80 more dive bombers are sent up to look for enemy cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall. They are located, attacked, and both destroyers are sunk. Now, the Japanese squadron continues to hunt the Allied ships, which Admiral Somerville decides to disperse rather than have them attacked in mass and wiped out. His decision is approved by the Admiralty. So basically, Admiral Somerville doesn't want to leave, as they say, all of his eggs in one basket, so he splits the fleet up, especially after the loss of the 2 destroyers that were easily sunk by those 80 Japanese aircraft. So, in the 6th of April, heavy Japanese attacks, okay, continue in the Bataan Peninsula. Now, the Americans and Filipinos are carrying out, constant counterattacks, but are continually now being driven back by Japanese, who now have overwhelming air and artillery support. Of course, are fully supplied. End of date, defenders had to withdraw further in the San Vicente area. In Burma, the Japanese land reinforcements at Rangoon. Now, Chiang Kai-shek visits the front and recommends that the Shan states on the Chinese frontier should be defended to the last man. 2 Chinese divisions are now in defensive positions in the Sitang Valley and almost halfway between Rangoon and Mandalay. Now, in the Admiralty Islands, okay, a small Japanese contingent from Truk lands at the extreme northeast of Manus Island. The Admiralty Islands are part of Bismarck Archipelago, north of New Guinea. The Japanese threat to Australia goes stronger and stronger, and meanwhile, also on the 6th of April 1942, the first Japanese bombing raids on India at Kokanada near Madras are performed. The Japanese, meanwhile, in Philippines continue their advance in Bataan Peninsula. In eastern sector, their divisions press on from Mount Samat, pushing the defenders back to Limay. Some sort of defensive line is established, in that area, but the Americans and Filipinos defend themselves very effectively in western sector, only slowly retiring from Bagak. Now, the submarine Sea Dragon evacuates pilots and other specialist personnel from Corregidor. In the Bataan Peninsula, the fighting continues in eastern sector. The American front collapses completely under Japanese pressure, and Japanese soon break through emergency defensive lines too. The thing is looking bleak. Now, the Americans and Filipinos are routed. General King decides that the Luzon force will have to surrender and orders the destruction of all equipment during the night. And only 2,000 of the 78,000 men in the 2 corps on Luzon can now be evacuated to Corregidor. So basically, there's going to be a lot of men that they have to leave behind. Now, in Luzon on April 9th at 3:30 a.m. officers sent by General King go forward with a white flag to the Japanese advanced position to begin negotiations for surrender, and the Japanese demand unconditional surrender, which comes into effect at 12:30 p.m. on April 9th. Now, then follows, okay, the mopping up operations and the terrible Bataan march, okay, of 76,000 men, including 12,000 Americans towards San Fernando. Now, thousands of these men put on this horrific death march will die of starvation, exposure and dysentery during that march, which later became known as the March of Death. Japanese artillery sighted at Kakaban on south coast of Peninsula opened fire on Corregidor, already under attack from Japanese aircraft, and surrender of Bataan is later approved by Roosevelt. The garrison at island of Cebu is warned that a Japanese landing force is also approaching them. In Burma, meanwhile, the first Burmese Japanese Corps, the redeployed Allied forces, is put on a front of 37 miles in between Minhla and another town in the area in the Irrawaddy Basin to defend the oil wells in the area, which clearly the Japanese want to secure. In the Indian Ocean, meanwhile, the hunt for the British ships continues. Japanese aircraft from Admiral Kondo's squadron make a heavy attack on the base at Trinco, Mali, on the east coast of the island of Ceylon, destroying naval and air installations. At the same time, a British aircraft carrier and a destroyer are reported 70 miles south, also on the island's east coast. Now, shortly after, the aircraft carrier Hermes, undefended as its aircraft have taken off in an unsuccessful attempt to find and attack the Japanese fleet. So the Hermes and the destroyer Vampire are attacked and sunk within the space of only 10 minutes. A 10,000-ton transport is also sunk a short way to the north of the British warships. Now, at the same time, another Japanese fleet, including 6 heavy cruisers, the light aircraft carrier Ryujo, under Vice Admiral Kurita, enters the Bay of Bengal and sinks about 135,000 tons of shipping, almost all engaged in carrying troops and supplies to Burma, which is a big blow. The 2 Japanese squadrons pass through Strait of Malacca and return to their bases unscathed. So a very effective day for the Japanese. A British aircraft carrier and a destroyer have been sunk. Multiple installations have been destroyed. Very, very successful days for the Japanese. Now, in the Philippines, the Japanese land on Cebu and near Toledo on Cebu Island. The garrison of 6,500 American and Filipino fighters retire inland, defending important road junctions. Now, in the Indian Ocean, in consequence of Japanese air and naval activity south of Ceylon, Royal Navy leaves the Indian Ocean and takes refuge in the Persian Gulf. Now, Winston Churchill, meanwhile, asked the Americans if they can undertake some large-scale action in the Pacific to draw off the Japanese forces, which surprisingly do not exploit their success immediately, but concentrate their efforts further on New Guinea and the New Hebrides in order to complete the isolation of Australia. So things are looking still bleak. The Japanese offensive that started at Pearl Harbor and erupted everywhere is still ongoing in multiple territories. The Japanese are having major successes, but these successes will not go on forever. We are approaching 2 major battles in the Pacific that partially change the route of things. One is the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the other is the Battle of Midway that I will, of course, cover in more detail. Now, the Americans and Philippines on Cebu were unable to hold up the Japanese, who advanced eastwards from Toledo and cannot effectively be held. Now, in Burma, the Japanese passed to the offensive in central sector of the line held by the 1st Burmese Corps. In the Philippines, the defending forces on Cebu retire to northern mountains to organise guerrilla operations. Now, with batteries sighted on southern part of Bataan and at Cavite, the Japanese intensify the shelling of Corregidor and continue to attack it from the air. The end is not far away. In Burma, Chinese 38th Division, which had been responsible for the defence of Mandalay, is moved to the Irrawaddy front in support of the 1st Burmese Corps. Now, during the night, the Japanese take some towns in the area, leaving western flank of all Burmese forces totally undefended. Now, Pandit Nehru speaks on the failure of the Delhi talks. He says, "It distresses me that any Indian should talk of the Japanese liberating India," because that is a mantra that is going around. The Japanese are coming to liberate India. No, they're coming to conquer. In the Philippines, Cebu is now firmly in Japanese hands, although there's some sporadic guerrilla action by the defenders. While in Burma, the Japanese break through centre at 1st Burmese Corps' defensive line and push on northwards towards the all-important oil wells. Now, the Chinese and British reinforces the defences of Lashio, Magway and many other areas on the Thailand border. The Chinese 66th Army is ordered to concentrate south of Mandalay in an effort to check the Japanese advance and make the Japanese think twice. Now, the defenders commence the destructions of oil fields in the area to deny them to the Japanese. The Japanese, meanwhile, begin to surround the Chinese 55th Division in the area of Mauche and Loikaw. Things are not going well at all. In fact, everything that is being done at the moment are kind of holding actions, only really in Bataan, Luzon, in the Philippines, have they effected any kind of effective defence. Everywhere else, it's always preliminary defence, but eventually they get pushed back and overrun. The Japanese push on northwards in Burma, bypassing the 1st Burmese Division, and they are just not stopping. Now, meanwhile, okay, on 16th of April, General Wainwright from the US appoints General Sharp to command his troops in central Philippines. Now, having occupied Cebu, the Japanese land over 4,000 men on Panay Island, mostly near the capital, in the south, and at Capiz in the northeast. Now, the 7,000 strong garrison, rather than take on invaders, withdraws inland into mountains to operate as guerrillas. Now, in Burma on Irrawaddy front, okay, the Japanese cut the road north and south of Pinchang, okay, and the Chinese 38th Division and part of 17th Indian Division are rushed to area of Magway to relieve enemy pressure on the 1st Burmese Division, which is still cut off, but sadly they are unsuccessful. On the Sitang front, following reversal suffered by 1st Burmese Corps, General Stilwell's Chinese forces have to give up defences in that area. Japanese maintain pressure on Japanese 55th Division in the Mauchi area. Now, in the Pacific, the command structure in Southwest Pacific is changed. Under MacArthur, okay, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander, are the Commander-in-Chief of Australian Forces, which is General Blamey, who will be in charge of all land operations, okay. The American General Brett will be at the head of the Air Forces, and Admiral Leary will head the Anzac Forces, which is the Australian and New Zealand forces, who will also command naval forces. Now, in Burma, Chinese and British troops retire in the Sitang Valley. Chinese 55th Division is effectively wiped out by Japanese south of Loikaw, leaving the road to Lashio wide open to the Japanese. The Japanese 22nd Division withdraws northwards. And also on this day, on April 18th, okay, the first air raid on Japan. Now, 16 B-25 bombers, okay, of Bomber Commander 8th US Air Force, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, take off from aircraft carrier Hornet about 750 miles from Tokyo. Now, the Hornet and her escort, okay, the cruisers Vincennes and Nashville with a complement of destroyers left on the 14th from a rendezvous north of Midway Island. Now, another carrier, the Enterprise, joins them near Japan to provide fighter escort. The B-25s arrive over at targets on 12:15 p.m, dropping bombs on Tokyo, Kobe, Yokohama, Nagoya and Yokosuka. They then fly onwards towards China, but owing to bad weather, they either crash on landing or the crew's mate parachute jumps. One aircraft lands near Vladivostok, and its crew is interned by the Russians. Two planes end up in Japanese-occupied territory, where the crews are made prisoners, some being shot on October 15th, 1942, for what was deemed a cowardly action, but it's not more cowardly than the brutal attack on Pearl Harbor that precipitated the Japanese conflict in the Pacific. Now, the aircraft carriers and other ships taking part return unharmed. Now, although material results at rate are trivial, the psychological effect on the Japanese system is profound. They never expected Japanese sovereign land in the homeland to be bombed this way so early. And also, this bombing raid by Doolittle and those 16 B-25 bombers is also the major cause of the Japanese call to pull the American carriers into battle and effectively destroy them once and for all, which leads to the Battle of Midway. This bombing attack on the Japanese directly influences their desire for the Battle of Midway later. So in the Philippines, the Japanese announced the capture of Cebu. Now in Burma, there's an increasing threat, okay, to Burma Road, the route by which Allied supplies are sent to China as the Chinese columns converge south of Loikaw. In the Philippines, okay, Japanese proceed with the capture of Panay Island and are now virtually masters at central Philippines. The small garrisons on Negros, Samar, Leyte, of course, which will come to prominence in one of the most savage air and sea battles of the Second World War, i.e. Leyte Gulf, which will be covered later, during the re-attack on the Philippines. Major air and sea battle, Leyte Gulf, and Bohol are in no position to check the Japanese. The war is not going well in the Pacific, okay? Odd successes, but the war is not going well, but change is coming. Now in Burma, the Japanese make contact with Chinese 6th Army at Ho Pong. Now elements at Chinese 49th Army quickly switch west and engage the enemy in the Mongpon area. In Burma, also, General Stilwell moves the Chinese 200 divisions from Meiktila to counterattack the enemy's movements in the Laikor Loilam area. Chinese 28th Division should have moved to the Loilam area, but the order is not carried out. The Chinese 96th Division, meanwhile, continues with its rearguard actions in the Sitang Valley, while the 17th Indian Division and the 7th Armoured Brigade and the Chinese 22nd Division take up positions near Meiktila, near Thazi. So in Burma, okay, General Alexander now orders an immediate withdrawal from the Meiktila line to the north bank of the Irrawaddy. Now in the Meiktila sector, Chinese 22nd Division is effectively surrounded by Japanese forces. Chinese 5th Army drives the Japanese back from Tangi, but cannot halt their advance towards Lashio, a position of great strategic importance. In Burma, okay, fearing that Burma is lost, General Alexander decides to concentrate all forces he has at his command on the defense of India itself. In the Philippines, meanwhile, a strong Japanese contingent, 5,000 men, sails from Cebu to Mindanao to reinforce the troops who've landed there some time ago and are now engaged in combat with several Filipino units. The Japanese on Mindanao attack the defending forces mercilessly to prevent them from concentrating on holding off the new landing force that is on the way. Now, meanwhile, in Burma, the Chinese 28th Division at present at Mandalay is sent urgently to Lashio in imminent danger of capture by the Japanese. The Japanese, however, occupy Keshi Mansam. Now on Mindanao, the Japanese reinforcements from Cebu land on west coast near Parang and capture both towns in the area. One regiment and 2 Filipino battalions fight bravely, but they're unable to prevent 2 bridgeheads being opened up. Now the Japanese, who've already landed at Davao, advance northwestwards towards Bugo. The Japanese have highly effective air support, and on Luzon, the shelling and bombing of the fortified island of Corregidor is re-intensified. That to the Japanese, is one of their major targets to finally flush out. In New Guinea, Japanese who were considering invasion of Australia make arrangements for the invasion of the capital Papua. Okay, Port Moresby. The landing is codenamed Operation Mo. Now in Burma, the Japanese seize Lashio, the terminus at Burma Road, a major strategic position by which supplies are dispatched to China. Now China is thus completely cut off and from now on can only be supplied by the air. The Chinese 200th Division reaches Loilam, but then turns around and marches back towards the Chinese frontier. General Alexander decides to set up a new defensive line between Kalewa, Katha, Bamo. All available troops will begin to fall back to this new defensive line on May 2nd in 3 days' time. So basically, okay, Philippines operations continue on Mindanao. Now troops from contingent that landed at Parang are taken off sea overnight and landed south of Malabang. Now at dawn they attack and push back Filipino 61st Infantry Regiment and advance an area of 7 miles. The Japanese who landed at Cotabato advance up the Mindanao River and reach Phuket. Now in Burma, the Japanese have now captured the whole of central Burma with their incessant assaults. British forces retire behind the Irrawaddy across the Ava Bridge, which is then blown up to slow down the Japanese advance. The Chinese division in the area, having covered the British withdrawal, retires from Mandalay, and the Allies have doubts about defensive line that's currently being established by General Alexander's forces, and it seems possible that all forces at Chinese 5th Army may have to be withdrawn to Imphal in India, of course the site of a future bloody campaign, 2 campaigns, Imphal and Kohima. Meanwhile, in the Philippines on May 1st, fighting continues on Mindanao, and so does the air and artillery offensive against Corregidor. In Burma, meanwhile, the Japanese capture Mandalay and Monya. This just continues. The Japanese, like I said before the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese are like a tsunami. They show up everywhere, okay? They have meticulously planned multiple raids, even from, some ships being sighted carrying Japanese troops even days before Pearl Harbor. As I covered, these plans were laid out and are being carried out effectively. And now, 4 months into 1942, so nearly 5 months since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese gains really have been incredible, and they are still on the ascendancy. So, okay, in parts of Mindanao, Japanese offensive thrust is held up by Filipino troops, still fighting bravely, the Filipino troops. The Japanese who landed at Cotabato advance eastwards towards Cabacan, which is reinforced with all available forces. Another convoy is sighted off the island, presumably bringing more Japanese forces. Now, it's Solomon Islands, it's south of the archipelago of Guadalcanal. A Japanese convoy is preparing to land troops on the small island of Tulagi. Tiny garrison, a detachment of the Australian Air Force, immediately destroys all the island's installations and embarks to head for the New Hebrides. The Americans have broken the Japanese naval code. Meanwhile, a fantastic achievement, and are now aware of the new landing. The officer commanding the naval squadron patrolling Coral Sea, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, immediately makes for Tulagi. Now, what I will do is, okay, I will cover the battle of the Coral Sea more directly in one go. In Burma, 3 brigades at 1st Burmese Corps attack Monya, just captured by Japanese but are repulsed. They do retire in disorder while the rest of the Burmese forces falls back in the area as well. They're still not having no real luck at all. So basically, okay, in Solomon Islands, a small Japanese contingent lands on Tulagi as expected and immediately starts to convert it into a seaplane base for support of the landing operations at Port Moresby in New Guinea, the gateway to Australia. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher arrives in the area with the Yorktown and escorting ships, but Japanese have already left and the Americans are only able to sink some enemy transports. Meanwhile, in the Philippines at 1 a.m. on May 3rd, okay, Japanese amphibious units from Panay Island land in Mindanao and at once begin to march south. Now, the Filipinos are unable to hold them up anymore. More Japanese troops arrive at Cabacan and the defending troops have to also retire inland and head for the hills. Air and artillery activity against Corregidor, the prelude to invasion, continues incessantly day after day. Now, on Mindanao, the Filipinos complete their withdrawal to a new defensive line in the Puntian sector. A third regrouping of units defending the valley of Cagayan. There's only air activity on part of the Japanese. The Allied air activity has now effectively been neutralized. In Luzon, the bombardment of Corregidor rises to a climax. At least 16,000 bombs and shells are fired at Corregidor on May 4th alone. Incessant Japanese artillery and bombing assault. In New Britain, meanwhile, a Japanese invasion fleet leaves Rabaul for Port Moresby. In Burma, the British abandon Akyab on the Bay of Bengal. Now, Japanese take Bamo and rout the Chinese 29th Division at Wanting. Chiang Kai-shek, okay, orders Chinese 5th Army to concentrate in the Myitkyina area. So, in Madagascar, meanwhile, a British naval squadron, okay, commanded by Rear Admiral Seifert and consisting of battleship Ramillies, the aircraft carriers Indomitable and Illustrious, the light cruiser Hemone and the Dutch cruiser Van Heemskerk, and 4 destroyers land a British force at Korea Bay on the northeast of the island, which captures the ports of Diego Suarez and Anti-Serene. Now, local garrisons loyal to the Vichy government offer little more than token resistance. Diego Suarez is quickly converted into a big air and naval base, which is to be of major help against the Japanese, and the US states approval of Britain's actions and warns Vichy government against resistance. So in the Philippines, okay, after a deadly air and artillery barrage near North Point, the Japanese land on Corregidor. On Mindanao, the Filipinos organise a new defensive line. Meanwhile, General Stilwell in Burma, who, with the Chinese retiring in recent events, learns at Indore that the railway has been cut and the enemy has captured Bamo. He therefore decides to withdraw into India instead of China. Meanwhile, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters send orders for the fleet to make preparations for the invasion of Midway Island and the Aleutians. This, of course, it's kind of a knee-jerk response to the bombing of Japanese land by those B-25 bombers by, Doolittle. Really did affect the Japanese psyche. They thought they were safe for now. Now, in the Philippines, after a whole day's negotiations, General Wainwright signs the document by which all American and Filipinos surrender unconditionally to the Japanese General Masaharu Homma. The Japanese capture the Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor and land new forces. On Mindanao, the Japanese renew their offensive, taking Tangkalan, which they subject to vicious artillery fire. So basically, the final event, May 7th in the Philippines, General Wainwright broadcast from Manila to announce his surrender, implicitly inviting all American and Filipino units still holding out in various islands to lay down their arms. The Japanese have taken 15,000 prisoners on Corregidor. On Mindanao, they confine themselves to air and artillery activity. So the battle, the long, hard 6-month battle for the Philippines is effectively over. We've had the death march of Bataan, the outrageous, to me, war crime, and the fighting in the Pacific continues. But we will be back in part 4 to cover the Battle of Coral Sea and leading up to the decisive Battle of Midway. I'm out for now.